Hey guys, tonight we walk beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver, where the domes of Constantinople glint through the cold haze, and every breath leaves a ghost behind you. The air bites your skin like a jealous god demanding tribute, and your boots crunch across a mosaic of frost that has crept over marble streets. You probably won't survive this, at least not without losing a few fingers or an unhealthy amount of optimism. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm really curious, where in the world are you watching this from, and what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk past the Theodosian walls, 3 layers of brick and pride, still scarred from centuries of siege engines and earthquakes, yet standing unbroken against the season's siege of ice. The Golden Horn has frozen in patches, trapping small boats like toys abandoned in a forgotten bath, and the fishermen who once filled the air with shouts now mutter about divine punishment for laziness. Above, the Hagia Sophia gleams through drifting snow, its vast dome like the frozen lid of heaven. Inside, the faint warmth of incense fights a losing battle against drafts that whisper down from the upper galleries. The candles flicker in resignation, and you can almost imagine the architects still arguing about whether Justinian's masterpiece was too grand for human endurance or too fragile for divine approval. You watch acolytes sweep frost from the mosaic floors, muttering prayers in Greek, Latin, and something halfway between faith and frostbite. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you recall the mainstream historical fact that Emperor Justinian himself witnessed a blizzard so fierce it shut down the city's grain markets for a week, forcing senators to trudge through snowdrifts like commoners. The empire may have been built on theology and bureaucracy, but winter reminded everyone who was boss. You feel the same chill now that he must have felt in his palace, a sharp, unignorable reminder that even divine right can catch a cold. Snow gathers on the shoulders of bronze statues, white cloaks for heroes long dead. The hippodrome is silent, its once roaring crowds replaced by crows hopping over the stone spina, where chariot races once decided fates. The city seems to hold its breath, as though waiting for spring's mercy, or maybe for another tax decree. Your fingers brush the cold marble of a fountain, the water within frozen mid-gush, a perfect sculpture of motion turned stillness. It's oddly poetic, in the same way a spilled amphora is poetic, when you're too numb to care. Somewhere beyond the gates, soldiers guard the approaches to Thrace, stamping their feet to keep feeling in them. They complain softly, of course, because grumbling too loudly in the capital is basically a theological crime, that the imperial armory issued more sermons than socks. You can't blame them. When the wind howls across the Bosporus, it sounds less like nature and more like bureaucracy sighing. Still, the city survives, because Constantinople always survives. Every snowstorm becomes another layer of legend, another excuse for poets to write about endurance while secretly wishing they lived somewhere warmer, like Alexandria. The cold even gives the marble a new texture, a kind of temporary holiness. You imagine touching the outer wall of Hagia Sophia and feeling that faint pulse of time itself, 1,000 winters humming beneath your fingertips, whispering that no empire is eternal, but some manage a remarkably long afterlife. You think about the quirky tidbit that during one especially brutal winter, enterprising bakers supposedly sold holy snow loaves, bread mixed with melted flakes, gathered from the church roof, because people believed it absorbed divine protection. It didn't, but faith has never been about success rates. The city, half-starved of sunlight, becomes its own mythological creature. Cats, the true rulers of Constantinople, pad silently through alleys, tails held high against the chill. You spot one curled on a fragment of ancient column, purring as though the empire itself vibrates beneath it. In that moment, you understand something the chroniclers rarely mention. Byzantium wasn't built on glory, it was built on stubbornness, the same kind that keeps a cat napping through a snowstorm. The bells of a distant monastery ring, muffled by snow, marking another hour lost to history. You trace a line in the frost on a parapet and think about how the empire's walls outlasted emperors, revolts, crusades, and theological fistfights that make modern comment sections look polite. Somewhere deep in the city, a scholar wraps himself in parchment-thick robes and debates the open scholarly question that still puzzles historians, whether Constantinople's resilience came from divine favor or just an extremely efficient tax system that could fund snow shoveling at near miraculous speed. Either way, the result is the same. You stand on the greatest fortress of the medieval world, hearing the quiet heartbeat of civilization under snow. You breathe in the faint mix of sea salt, incense, and wood smoke, a scent that feels older than language. The light fades, soft and amber, bouncing from domes to icicles in a chain of reflections that could almost pass for prayer. Somewhere, a scribe sneezes and smudges history with ink, ensuring that centuries later, someone will argue over what he meant. The city endures the way marble endures wind, slowly, gracefully, and with just enough vanity to make eternity blush. You pull your cloak tighter, listening to the crackle of ice on the tiles above, and realize that in Byzantium, winter isn't an enemy, it's a mirror, showing what remains when the empire's gold freezes into silence. You leave the city behind beneath a pale crescent moon, its walls shrinking into the haze as your boots crunch through the frozen outskirts of Thrace, where the empire's polished marble gives way to mud, frost, and the slow rhythm of survival. The road ahead gleams faintly beneath a crust of snow, shimmering like a blade left too long in the cold, and your breath fogs around you as if history itself were exhaling through your lungs. You march beside soldiers wrapped in patchwork cloaks, their lamellar armor stiff with frost, each movement ringing with that hollow metallic rasp that only winter can compose. The countryside looks dead, but it isn't. It's only sleeping, like an empire caught between glories. Ravens pick at frozen scraps along the road, watching your progress with the kind of indifference only birds and bureaucrats can master. You pass a milestone etched with Greek, so worn it feels more like a whisper. 100 miles to Heraclea. You wonder if that's an encouragement or a warning. The wind bites at your cheeks, and you pull your cloak tighter, remembering that Thrace was the empire's old military corridor, the artery that fed Constantinople's wars. Even now, every frozen stream and hill carries the memory of marching feet, the ghosts of logistics officers calculating rations down to the last loaf of barley bread. It's a humbling thought, how the empire didn't collapse from barbarians or heresy, but sometimes simply because the bread froze. The mainstream historical fact floats through your mind that Emperor Basil II once marched his troops through these very valleys during the campaign against the Bulgars, their supplies dwindling as icy rain turned trails into glass. Chroniclers wrote that men lost toes to frostbite and tempers to boredom, yet they kept marching because the emperor did. You step in their footprints now, and though the snow has long buried their bones, the weight of obedience still lingers in the air. You feel it with every step, that silent oath soldiers make when their empire pretends not to hear their teeth chattering. Across the plain, you see villages huddled against the wind like broken teeth in a frozen jaw. Smoke curls from thatched roofs, blue, thin, and hesitant, like the last note of a dying song. You can almost taste it, the mixture of pine and desperation. A few shepherds wrapped in wool stare as you pass, faces red and raw, their sheep shuffling nervously in the snow. One of them lifts a hand in a gesture that's either blessing or sarcasm. It's hard to tell the difference in Thrace. You think about the empire's reliance on these rural arteries, the constant push and pull between the capital's glittering vanity and the countryside's brutal realism. For all its cathedrals and silk markets, Byzantium was still held together by cold feet trudging through frozen mud. There's a kind of poetry in that if you squint past the frostbite, you cross a frozen river that groans beneath you, the ice webbed with cracks like veins under marble. Somewhere beneath that transparent sheet, fish drift half asleep, dreaming of warmer centuries. You pause on the bank and take in the silence, so total it feels alive, pressing against your eardrums. Then a gust of wind breaks it, carrying the faint clang of a distant bell from a roadside chapel. You turn toward it, curious, and find the chapel half buried in snow, its icon of St. George cracked but defiant. Inside, you light a candle, watching the flame tremble like a nervous pilgrim. It flickers blue, fighting the draft, and for a second it looks like the empire itself, brilliant, fragile, and stubbornly refusing to go out. You smile despite yourself, thinking of the quirky tidbit that Byzantine soldiers often carried small packets of olive oil not just for cooking, but to rub on metal parts of armor, and even their own faces to prevent freezing, a trick apparently borrowed from old Roman manuals. Imagine that the secret to surviving imperial winter wasn't divine protection, it was moisturizer. The path grows steeper as you approach the foothills of the Hemus Mountains. Pines creak under snow, and icicles hang like daggers from their branches. The sound of marching feet dulls to a muffled rhythm, a heartbeat of empire pulsing through the frost. Somewhere behind you, a soldier hums an off-key hymn, the words lost to wind, but the melody persistent enough to feel like defiance. You glance back and see the long line of men stretching into the distance, specks of bronze and breath against the white expanse. It's beautiful, in a bleak way, like art that never asked for an audience. Night falls early here. You stop by a ruined watchtower. Its stones glazed with ice, and make camp beside a dying fire that smells of damp pine. Sparks rise and vanish into the dark, and for a moment you feel the weight of all those who came before you, soldiers, emperors, dreamers, and bureaucrats, each convinced they were holding back the inevitable. The historian in you whispers the open scholarly debate that still animates late-night conferences. Was Byzantine endurance in these campaigns due to superior organization, or simply sheer luck that their enemies were just as cold? It's an oddly comforting mystery, because either answer means humanity has been winging it since the dawn of civilization. You lean back, staring up at a sky crusted with stars. They look brittle tonight, as if a careless breath could shatter them. The fire crackles softly, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howls. A sound both ancient and familiar, like the empire itself complaining about tax reforms. The scent of pine smoke clings to your cloak, mixing with salt and iron, and that faint metallic tang of winter air. You drift between wakefulness and memory, seeing in your mind the endless march of history, Byzantine banners fluttering, snow melting on helmets, dreams freezing before they can reach spring. You close your eyes, letting the rhythm of the cold settle in your chest, and realize something the historians never write. Endurance isn't heroic, it's just the art of staying tired longer than the weather. You wake before dawn in a frost-bitten camp pitched beneath the gray ribs of the Hemus Mountains, where the empire's ambitions creak louder than the trees. The world is blue and silent except for the soft hiss of your breath escaping the hood of your cloak. Snow clings to the tents like old parchment, every flap stiffens into a frozen decree. The emperor's pavilion rises at the center, a mound of gold-tipped silk that sparkles uselessly beneath the ice. You step closer, boots crunching on rime, and watch a squad of attendants wrestle with a chest of armor plates so cold they steam when touched by breath. Inside, the emperor prepares for inspection, and you realize that even the most divine ruler can't argue with the weather. The lamellar cuirass gleams like sunlight trapped in a glacier, every scale etched with crosses and eagles that the frost now claims as its own. A servant dips rags into warm wine to wipe the metal, and the smell mingles with the sharp tang of iron, sweat, and incense. Byzantine perfume at its most authentic. Somewhere in your mind drifts a mainstream historical fact. Chroniclers record that Emperor Maurice, famed for his Balkan campaigns, ordered his troops to drill in the snow so they'd never grow soft. You imagine his ghost now, nodding in frosty approval as soldiers stamp and curse under the same iron sky. You glance again at the armor and think it looks less like protection and more like punishment, a portable cathedral trapping its wearer between divinity and hypothermia. The emperor emerges at last, beard rimed with frost, his expression the same practiced serenity worn by men who know no one dares laugh. You bow instinctively, half from respect, half from the fear that your eyelids might freeze together if you blink too long. Around him the elite officers stiffen, their plumes frozen into tiny icicles that sway when they breathe. A herald attempts to blow a trumpet. The note wheezes out like a dying goose, and you pretend not to notice. Beneath the pomp you sense fatigue. The long winters of bureaucracy, the endless paperwork of empire turned into frostbitten ritual. You recall the quirky tidbit that certain Byzantine armorers lined breastplates with thin layers of wool soaked in olive oil to keep out cold spirits. It didn't work, of course, but it probably made accountants feel useful. The emperor mounts a black horse whose mane smokes in the cold, and the procession moves out across the field, metal creaking, hooves cracking the crusted snow. You walk beside the column, feeling the rhythm of history underfoot, conquest wrapped in goosebumps. The wind picks up, flinging shards of ice that glitter like broken relics, and you pull your hood tight as the sun climbs weakly over the peaks. Light flashes off helmets and spearheads until the whole army looks like a mirror, shattered into 1,000 pieces. Somewhere behind you, a monk trails with a censer, swinging sweet smoke that immediately freezes mid-swirl. The air smells briefly of heaven before returning to bureaucracy. You think about how empires always imagine themselves eternal, yet nothing ages faster than authority in bad weather. The scholarly debate comes to mind, the one arguing whether Byzantine success in winter warfare owed more to superior logistics or to divine theater. Those gleaming processions, those golden icons carried into blizzards, convincing men that frostbite was a sacrament. The truth, as always, probably sat shivering between both. You watch the emperor pause at a ridge, surveying the valley below, his armor catching the pale sun like a coin tossed to fate. He looks magnificent and miserable all at once, the human contradiction of empire rendered in metal and frost. A scribe nearby tries to record the moment, ink freezing on his quill, so he scratches the rest with soot. You smile faintly. Someday historians will argue about whether this day even happened, because the evidence will have melted. The march resumes, the sound of chains, banners, and prayer folding into the wind. You realize that glory, when stripped of its pageantry, sounds a lot like chattering teeth. By nightfall, the army camps again, fires blinking across the plain like fallen constellations. The emperor's tent glows faintly, a golden cocoon in a sea of white. Inside, he will hang that freezing armor on a rack beside icons of saints who look suspiciously comfortable. You stand outside, letting snow gather on your shoulders, and feel a strange kinship with both ruler and soldier, each pretending warmth for the sake of the other. The stars above burn steady and cold, indifferent witnesses to another winter campaign, another promise of victory whispered into frozen air. Somewhere in the dark, a horse snorts, a banner flaps, and the empire dreams again of spring. You reach the edge of a battlefield that looks less like war and more like the inside of a snow globe, shaken by a vengeful god. The fortress of Dorostalon rises ahead, half buried in white, its towers glittering with frost like jewelry worn by someone too proud to admit bankruptcy. The Danube lies frozen beside it, an unbroken sheet of glass reflecting gray sky and gray ambitions. You stand among ranks of weary soldiers whose breath fogs like dragon smoke, watching engineers struggle with catapults that creak and groan as if they too are reconsidering their life choices. Every sound in this frozen siege feels muted and deliberate, the dull thud of a ram against a gate turned brittle, the occasional clatter of dropped armor that echoes like a cracked bell. War, it seems, has slowed to the pace of a glacier. You shuffle closer to the lines, your boots breaking through the crust of snow, and think about how siegecraft was supposed to be a science in Byzantium. Geometry, trajectories, ratios. Yet none of that math accounts for ice turning boiling oil into soup before it hits the enemy. A soldier beside you mutters that it's too cold for treachery, which in military terms means morale is officially frozen. The mainstream historical fact hums in your mind that in 971 Emperor John Zimiscus besieged this very fortress during his campaign against the Rus, a winter so bitter that even the chronicles described snow like falling ashes from the wrath of God. You imagine standing there with him, breath visible beneath a golden helmet, realizing that frost could humble even divine vengeance. His engineers burned wagons to melt ice off the ropes of catapults, but the cold simply laughed and froze the ashes mid-air. You look across the field now and see history repeating itself. Different emperor, same frostbitten pride. Smoke rises in thin gray ribbons where firepots fail to ignite, curling lazily upward only to vanish into the wind. Somewhere in the siege line, a cook beats on a frozen barrel to loosen what might once have been soup. The smell of smoke and wet wood mixes with the faint sweetness of pitch, a perfume of perseverance. You can almost hear the ghosts of chroniclers dipping quills into ink that freezes before the words form, inventing metaphors just to stay warm. The defenders on the wall look down, faceless behind scarves of fur, and you realize they're as miserable as you are. Between the two sides lies a white no-man's land, smooth and unbroken except for the occasional spear jutting from the snow like punctuation marks in an unfinished sentence. A crow lands on one and croaks, unimpressed. You try to imagine the bureaucracy behind all this, some clerk in Constantinople, filing a form labeled Siege Ongoing, Temperature Hopeless. The idea makes you smile despite the cold. Your humor steams in the air for a second before freezing into sincerity. Then you spot a group of monks trudging toward the front line carrying icons draped in frost, chanting hymns that sound more like lullabies for the dying. The soldiers kneel briefly as the procession passes, their armor creaking like frozen bread crusts. It's an oddly beautiful moment, faith wrapped in ice, hope exhaling clouds into the indifferent wind. The quirky tidbit surfaces in your mind that during one winter siege, Byzantine troops reportedly mixed snow into their mortar to bind the stones faster by divine chill, convinced that God himself approved of shortcuts. It didn't help, but it produced an impressive batch of holy slush. You can't decide if that's innovation or desperation, but either way, it's relatable. The siege drags on. Days blur into pale light and darker cold. You measure time not in hours, but in how deep the frost climbs up the tents. The river freezes solid enough for oxen to cross, and someone jokingly suggests charging across it to flank the enemy. No one laughs, it's too plausible. At night, the stars shimmer above like shards of Byzantine glass, and the moon reflects off the ice so brightly it hurts to look. Fires burn low. Soldiers huddle together, murmuring half-remembered prayers to saints of warmth who probably never existed. You listen to the steady creak of wooden towers inching forward, frost snapping in their beams, and it occurs to you that winter has become the real besieger here. The fortress and the army both endure, locked in a stalemate orchestrated by the weather. You recall an open scholarly debate that still divides historians, whether Byzantine commanders intentionally launched winter sieges to exploit enemy starvation or simply lacked the calendar management to avoid them. The arguments get academic, but standing here in the cold, you suspect it was neither genius nor folly, just necessity wearing a frozen grin. You walk closer to the siege engines as dawn breaks, the sky blushing faintly behind a haze of snow. The first stones fly, sluggish arcs tracing pale trails through the air before landing with anticlimactic thuds that bury themselves more in powder than in pride. The defenders return fire with arrows that glitter like silver rain, whistling softly through the still air before vanishing into the whiteness. One sticks into the snow at your feet, its head rimed with ice, harmless as an accusation. You pick it up, admiring how something meant for death can look so decorative. By midday, the wind shifts, blowing smoke and snow together, until the battlefield looks like a painting left too long in the rain. You can barely see the lines now, just the movement of shadows, the muffled clang of iron, the slow dance of persistence. A catapult collapses under its own frozen ropes with a groan that sounds suspiciously like "I told you so." Somewhere, an officer shouts orders no one hears. The Empire grinds on through the blizzard, driven not by glory but by habit. As twilight returns, the fortress still stands, a silhouette of defiance against a world gone white. The fires flicker below the walls, casting orange halos that fade into blue snow. You stand there watching your breath rise like smoke from the dying day, and understand that in Byzantium, victory was never a moment. It was the stubborn refusal to admit defeat, even when the ice itself whispered otherwise. You make your way to a small chapel at the edge of the camp, a structure of rough stone and humility, its dome barely visible beneath the icicles hanging like organ pipes from the eaves. A monk stands outside, swinging a censer that releases a trickle of incense smoke, sweet and faintly resinous, the scent of frankincense fighting a losing war against the smell of wet wool. You step inside, brushing snow from your cloak, and find yourself in a world of muted gold and candle flame. Light shivers on mosaic walls depicting saints wrapped in golden halos that seem to radiate actual warmth, or maybe that's wishful thinking. The air hums softly with chanting, voices so low and tired they could pass for the breathing of history itself. The monks sing the same hymns they sang during the siege, each note rising like vapor from a boiling pot left too long on the fire. You sit at the back, your body thawing in slow increments, and notice how each candle drips wax onto the floor, forming tiny frozen stalagmites of devotion. The empire has always measured its endurance in such drips, each act of piety, another drop of wax solidifying into survival. A passage of scripture is read, the Greek lilting and archaic, and you think about how this same rhythm echoed through earthquakes, invasions and theological committees that lasted longer than most marriages. The mainstream historical fact comes to mind. During the reign of Emperor Theophilus in the 9th century, when a brutal winter paralyzed Constantinople, the imperial treasury was opened to feed the poor, and the emperor himself reportedly went among the people distributing bread. Some said it was compassion, others whispered it was politics wearing mittens. Either way, it warmed someone. You imagine the scene, the gold of the court melting into the hunger of the streets, and wonder if holiness might simply be well-timed generosity. A draught slips through the cracks of the chapel door, snuffing out one of the candles, and a monk crosses himself reflexively before relighting it. That small act feels like the entire Byzantine worldview condensed into a gesture, the acknowledgement that faith, like fire, always flickers but rarely dies. You glance upward. The dome above is painted with a Christ Pantocrator, whose eyes follow you calm and unbothered by the frost creeping down his own mural. It's a reminder that the empire never separated art from eternity. Even decay had to look sacred. You notice the floor beneath your feet, mosaics of sea creatures and flowers, fragments from an older basilica repurposed for this chapel. Recycling holiness is another Byzantine specialty. Outside, the wind moans softly through the bell tower, sounding for all the world like a sermon preached to snowdrifts. You close your eyes and breathe in the mingled scents of wax, stone, and cold metal, feeling them settle into your lungs like relics. Somewhere, someone coughs, a deep, ragged sound that breaks the illusion of divinity, reminding you that even monks catch colds. A few of them shuffle past you, their sandals slapping softly against the marble, robes brushing the ground like whispers. You hear one murmur about the icicles bending the roof beams, and for a moment you imagine a theological council convened to determine whether frozen water counts as divine punishment or decorative grace. It's absurd, and yet exactly the kind of argument Byzantium adored. The quirky tidbit bubbles up from your memory that in some monasteries it was custom to bless snow and store it in amphorae as a symbol of purity, though one chronicle insists the supply was mostly used to chill wine during summer fasts. Sanctity, apparently, had a practical side. The thought makes you smile. You step back outside into the blinding light, where the snow crunches beneath your boots like sugar. The monks have strung small bells from the chapel roof, and the wind rings them gently, creating a sound that feels less like music and more like weather praying. Across the valley, smoke rises from the ruins of the siege, a faint gray reminder that violence and sanctity share the same air. You think about the empire's eternal balancing act, sword in one hand, cross in the other, both trembling from the same cold. Scholars still debate whether Byzantium survived so long because it believed or because it doubted in just the right measure. You suspect it was both. Faith here isn't certainty. It's endurance shaped like prayer. You turn your gaze toward the mountains, their peaks glowing pale blue under the thin sun, and feel that peculiar warmth that comes not from temperature, but from meaning. The sky above seems endless, a frozen canvas for divine intention, and you understand why monks chose to build their sanctuaries in the coldest, quietest places. There's something holy about discomfort. It keeps the mind awake. You breathe once more, watching the mist of your breath drift upward and vanish like incense escaping the mortal world. In Byzantium, even that small disappearance feels like theology. You move north along the Danube frontier where the empire's patience and its plumbing both begin to fail, a corridor of stone fortresses squatting along the river like frost-bitten sentinels. The wind carries the scent of pine and old smoke, a mixture that feels halfway between memory and warning. Every few miles, a watchtower looms from the whiteness, its top buried under snow so thick it might as well be a tomb for forgotten banners. You trudge past one outpost after another, each manned by soldiers who've learned to worship warmth more than saints, and realize that survival here is less about courage and more about keeping your socks dry. The river itself crawls beside you under a lid of ice, cracking in slow, echoing sighs. Somewhere across it lies Bulgaria, or steppe country, or whichever new threat the imperial cartographers haven't gotten around to labeling yet. It all blurs together in winter. You stop at a garrison called Dorastorum, its walls patched with mismatched stone like a quilt made by accountants. Inside, life hums in miniature, guards rubbing oil on sword hilts, cooks stirring barley porridge into the consistency of hope, and one overworked priest trying to bless snow as if it were holy water. You can't help admiring the stubborn efficiency, each frozen gesture part of the empire's great bureaucracy of endurance. The mainstream historical fact hums faintly in your mind that these Danubian forts, first laid down in the days of Constantine the Great, were rebuilt again and again through the centuries, often using the same stones, the same trenches, the same dreams of security that the climate politely ignored. You run a gloved hand along one weathered wall, and feel how the mortar turns brittle at your touch, how empire, like ice, is always one thaw away from collapse. Above you, a lookout calls down that snow clouds are thickening again, and you look up to see the sky folding in on itself, gray swallowing gray, until horizon and heaven trade places. Soon the blizzard arrives, soft at first, then furious, whipping flakes sideways until every shape becomes suggestion. The camp vanishes. Sound itself seems to freeze. Even the river's groans die under the hiss of falling snow. You hunch beneath your cloak, laughing quietly because this is exactly the kind of weather report Byzantine chroniclers described with phrases like "the heavens locked the earth in silence." You picture a scholar writing that by candlelight, ink freezing between adjectives. You press forward toward the barracks, where a fire burns low and orange, smoke curling lazily through a hole in the roof. Inside, soldiers cluster around it like petals around a dying flower. One of them passes you a mug of wine, so hot it stings your tongue, and for a moment civilization seems to have survived. The officer on duty is a man whose beard has frozen into a single glittering stalactite. He insists the garrison keeps watch for northern demons. You suspect he means raiders, but the phrasing feels more poetic. The quirky tidbit rises in your thoughts that Byzantine patrols sometimes reported seeing ice spirits on the riverbanks during blizzards, white figures moving through snowstorms that later turned out to be the enemy's camouflaged scouts. The empire, being practical, responded by assigning a new saint to handle spectral border security. Bureaucracy as theology. It's hard not to admire the efficiency. Outside, the blizzard intensifies, wrapping the world in a kind of cosmic privacy. The towers creak, snow piling against the gates until even the iron hinges groan. You imagine the chroniclers centuries from now trying to reconstruct this moment, and failing because cold doesn't leave evidence, only exhaustion. The open scholarly debate still stirs among historians. Were the Byzantine northern defenses truly effective, or merely symbolic gestures meant to reassure Constantinople's accountants that someone somewhere was freezing responsibly on their behalf? Standing here with numb fingers, you'd vote for the latter. The fort endures anyway. As night deepens, torches line the walls, their flames bending and guttering in the wind, tiny pockets of defiance glowing against the infinite white. You climb the parapet and stare into the blizzard, seeing nothing but the slow drift of eternity disguised as weather. The Danube below has vanished, the frontier erased. For a heartbeat there is no empire, only snow, stone, and the faint sound of your own pulse echoing in your ears. It occurs to you that Byzantium's greatest defense was never its walls but its capacity to find meaning in this silence, to keep calling it order even when the map turned blank. You breathe out and your breath disappears into the dark, another invisible offering to the cold gods of endurance. Somewhere behind you the fortress bells toll for the night watch, each note swallowed by the storm, and you smile, because in this empire even the act of shivering has become ritual. By the time the storm loosens its grip, the world has shrunk to a handful of shivering tents, a few mules that look philosophically resigned, and the stubborn glow of a mess fire that refuses extinction. You trudge toward it, boots sinking in half-frozen slush, following the scent of boiled something grain, onion despair, who can tell. The cook stirs a pot that burps weakly, muttering prayers to any saint known for seasoning. Around him soldiers huddle with wooden bowls, their armor dulled with frost, faces pink as pickled radishes. You join the queue because that's what survival means here. Faith in the possibility that the next ladleful might contain an actual vegetable. The spoon hits your palm, steaming. You taste, wince, and decide that hunger truly is the empire's greatest spice. Somewhere beyond the circle of firelight, snowdrifts glimmer like salt, and the world seems momentarily edible, if only metaphorically. You sit beside a pair of grizzled veterans, who are discussing supply logistics in tones normally reserved for theology. They're debating whether the arrival of dried figs from Thessalonica counts as a miracle or just poor planning. One gestures dramatically toward heaven, declaring that divine providence clearly prefers raisins. You decide to stay silent. You've seen how theological debates end here with indigestion and frostbite. The mainstream historical fact flickers in your mind that Byzantine armies were famous for their logistical ingenuity. Soldiers carried hardtack made of barley and honey, salted meat pressed into wax-sealed jars, and dried lentils that could last entire campaigns without spoiling. You picture those jars stacked neatly in some imperial warehouse, guarded by clerks with frost-bitten noses, and wonder if any empire in history ever truly conquered hunger. The fire pops, scattering embers across the snow. One lands on your boot. You brush it away, and think about how food shapes morale more than banners or speeches ever could. A nearby monk, serving as the army's conscience, blesses the meal with a cross traced in midair so quickly it's almost apologetic. The blessing doesn't improve the taste, but at least it sanctifies the chewing. Somewhere in the shadows, a soldier plucks a lyre missing 2 strings and hums what might be a love song or a lament for missing salt. The melody wobbles through the cold, thin, and tender, until it dissolves into the wind. You tilt your head back, watching breath and smoke mingle above the camp, and for a moment it looks like the empire exhaling its weariness into the sky. The quirky tidbit comes to you that some chroniclers mention imperial snow feasts, occasions when winter campaigns dragged too long, and soldiers improvised banquets from what they could scavenge, snow mixed with honey for dessert, icicles flavored with wine as novelty drinks. It sounds absurd, but you can almost imagine it. A line of laughing men toasting icicles under the stars, because laughter too counts as calories. You smile, realizing that the empire's survival owed as much to its sense of irony as to its engineering. The wind picks up again, scattering snow into the fire, so that each spark dies with a soft hiss, like applause for persistence. You pull your cloak tighter and feel the stiffness of frost in the fabric, the ache of cold settling into bone-deep acquaintance. Someone passes around a jug of something strong enough to sterilize wounds and start new wars. You take a sip, and warmth flares down your throat, unholy, blessed, entirely Byzantine. It's the kind of warmth that makes soldiers recite poetry they don't remember learning. One begins to describe Constantinople in summer, the smell of figs, the shimmer of the Bosporus, women carrying amphorae with wrists so graceful they could end wars. His voice wavers, then trails off, leaving behind only the crackle of the fire and the shared silence of men who remember warmth like an old hymn. You stare into the pot again and notice how the stew has congealed into a slow gelatinous swirl that somehow mirrors the empire itself, resilient, unappetizing, eternal. The quartermaster shuffles over, recording in his wax tablet that rations sufficient, morale moderate, weather hostile. You peek over his shoulder and almost laugh. Bureaucracy doesn't freeze, it just writes slower. You remember reading the open scholarly debate that still divides historians. Did Byzantine soldiers eat better or worse than their Western counterparts? One side insists on superior nutrition thanks to imperial logistics, the other argues that paperwork doesn't roast sheep. Judging by your own dinner, both are right. Still, there's a strange satisfaction in the routine. The scraping of bowls, the shared jokes, the small rituals of exhaustion that knit an army together. After the meal, the soldiers stretch out beside the embers, wrapped in cloaks that smell of smoke and humanity. The night settles heavy and cold, stars flickering like nail-heads hammered into the vault of heaven. You lie back, tracing your breath in the air, and wonder how many generations of soldiers stared at the same indifferent constellations while chewing the same flavorless grain. The empire endures not because it's mighty, but because it learns to make boredom sacred. A wolf howls somewhere across the plain, long and mournful, and someone mutters that even the beasts are fasting. You close your eyes listening to the sound of snow shifting against the tents, a soft rhythm like the breathing of the earth itself. Tomorrow there will be another march, another pot, another sermon about patience. But tonight, beneath the canopy of ice and smoke, you understand the quiet miracle of endurance, that even here, surrounded by frost and fatigue, Byzantium still finds a way to feast. By dawn, the blizzard has wandered off toward the Black Sea, leaving behind a sky so clear it looks polished by angels with nothing better to do. You march back toward civilization, or whatever passes for it in the empire's intellectual outposts, and find yourself at a monastery perched above a frozen valley. Its walls shine with frost, and the bells above the gate hang motionless, rimmed in crystal. Inside, warmth means something different, not fire, but thought. Here parchment is currency, and the monks trade in sentences instead of salt. You step into a library, where the air smells of ink, beeswax and mild despair. Scrolls lie stacked like sleeping snakes, and at a central table sits a scholar wrapped in 3 layers of wool, his nose red as a seal. He's arguing, mostly with himself, about the properties of snow. Every few minutes he breathes onto his glass spectacles, which immediately fog over, leaving him blinking like a man perpetually astonished by his own ignorance. You join him, curious. He gestures toward a tray of manuscripts drying beside the brazier, their edges curling from the heat. Condensation, he mutters, a philosophical mystery. You nod wisely, because in Byzantium, every physical inconvenience can be converted into theology. The scholar explains that he's writing a treatise on the metaphysics of cold, specifically whether ice is a form of divine stillness or merely water performing humility. It sounds ridiculous until you realize he's deadly serious. The mainstream historical fact hums in your mind. Byzantine universities and monasteries often served as weather archives, recording floods, eclipses, and unusual frosts as signs of celestial politics. A sudden snowfall might be read as commentary on imperial taxation. Knowledge here isn't about prediction, it's about interpretation, a climate of meaning as thick as the actual weather. The scholar dips his quill, pausing to warm the ink pot above the brazier, and you watch steam rise in tiny halos. He begins to read aloud from his notes, voice crackling like old parchment, descriptions of snowflakes as unfallen stars, of frost as the alphabet of angels written across the earth. You smile despite yourself. The empire that invented bureaucracy also invented poetry about icicles. Around you, novices shuffle past carrying bundles of wood, their sandals slapping softly on the flagstones. Each exhale hangs visible in the air like an annotation to the text of existence. You sit beside a window where frost patterns mimic mosaics from distant cathedrals, curling into loops and crosses as though creation itself couldn't resist ornamentation. Somewhere beyond the hills, soldiers still trudge through mud. But here, the battle is intellectual, footnotes versus hypothermia. The scholar pauses to pour tea brewed from something herbal and vaguely medicinal. The steam fogs his glasses again, and he sighs, defeated by physics. You take a sip. It tastes like optimism filtered through bark. He confides that the empire's real strength isn't in swords or sermons, but in the art of argument, an endless, warming friction of ideas. You think of the quirky tidbit that Byzantine scholars sometimes used snow itself to preserve parchment glue in summer and to cool ink in winter, essentially inventing primitive refrigeration centuries before anyone had a word for it. They called it the discipline of cold reason, which sounds like a philosophy course taught by someone perpetually disappointed in their students. Outside, wind taps gently at the shutters, a polite reminder that thought alone doesn't heat stone. You glance toward the shelves where scrolls lean against icons, secular and sacred cohabiting like old roommates. One manuscript's margin bears a doodle of a saint wearing earmuffs, a small rebellion in ink. The scholar catches you noticing and smirks, confessing that the monks compete secretly to draw the best heresies in miniature. Even in Byzantium, humor survives frost. The afternoon light fades to honey, washing the room in softness. You realize how the scholar's glasses, clouded and cleared again, mirror the empire itself, perpetually fogging, perpetually wiping itself back into focus, never quite transparent, but never entirely blind. He returns to writing, muttering about whether snow has memory, and you find yourself hypnotized by the rhythm of his quill, the scratch-scratch that sounds like the heartbeat of civilization refusing to freeze. The open scholarly debate surfaces again, the question that still teases historians. Were Byzantine intellectuals visionaries preserving the ancient world, or bureaucrats of eternity, cataloging thought the way tax collectors count sheep? Watching this scholar, you suspect the answer is yes to both. The candle beside him gutters low, flame trembling in the draught, and he cups it gently with one hand until it steadies. That simple act feels like the whole empire summarized, 1,000 years of holding small lights against large darkness. You step back into the corridor as night settles, air sharp and sweet with pine smoke. The bells finally ring the hour, dull, slow, deliberate. You breathe out and see your own mist join theirs, one more thought exhaled into the Byzantine winter, proof that even in the coldest corners of history, someone kept thinking just to stay warm. You return at last to Constantinople, that glittering frostbitten dream where empire and ocean meet under the same weary sky. The city looks different in winter, its marble palaces draped in a shroud of glittering ice, its domes reflecting the dull blue of a frozen dawn. The Bosporus itself lies half-stilled, patched with floes that grind softly against one another like the slow applause of exhausted gods. You stand at the harbor's edge, staring at ships imprisoned in translucent cages, their sails furled and stiff, ropes frozen into lines that look drawn by geometry rather than human hands. A gull lands on the prow of a galley and promptly slides off, offended by physics. You smile and pull your cloak tighter. The wind here cuts differently than in Thrace, sharper, saltier, perfumed faintly by the ghosts of centuries of trade. You walk along the quay where merchants huddle by braziers, their silks replaced by wool, their ambitions condensed into visible breath. Everyone moves slower in this weather, as though the empire's pulse itself has lowered to save energy. The fishermen have abandoned their boats, and instead drop nets from the bridges, breaking the surface ice with poles and muttering prayers to St. Nicholas. The mainstream historical fact drifts into your thoughts. The Bosporus has frozen several times in recorded history, most famously in the winter of 763 CE, when chroniclers claimed people and animals crossed from Europe to Asia on foot. Skeptics call it exaggeration, but then again, Byzantines were professional exaggerators. Half the empire ran on divine hyperbole. Still, you can picture it. The sea turned to glass, children skating between continents, while traders debated exchange rates for snowflakes. A cold mist rises now, blurring the city's edges until Hagia Sophia appears to float above the world, its dome catching the sunlight like a captured halo. The bells of Blockerney ring somewhere beyond the fog, dull and deliberate, their sound rolling over the frozen harbor in waves. You breathe deeply and catch the scent of tar, salt, and burnt olive oil from ship lamps. The sound of chisels rings nearby as dock workers hack ice from hulls, their blows echoing like slow percussion. Every strike sends shards flying, tiny suns scattering across the ground. A boy gathers them into a basket. Ice, the one commodity no one needs but everyone admires. You move on toward the sea walls, their stones sweating frost, and look out across the strait toward the faint outline of Chalcedon. The sunlight there glints off a single ship trapped mid-crossing, its oars frozen into stillness, an accidental monument to human optimism. You can't decide if it's tragic or deeply on brand. A quirky tidbit flickers in your memory that during one of these legendary freezes, an enterprising baker supposedly crossed the ice selling pastries shaped like fish to symbolize divine irony. He reportedly fell through on the return trip, but was canonized by local children for dedication to snacks. It's absurd, yet you believe it. Byzantium made a habit of turning bad weather into parables. The cold deepens as the day wanes. You find refuge in a tavern tucked behind the harbor warehouses, its door hanging crooked, its sign painted with a cheerful dolphin whose smile has cracked with the wood. Inside, heat blooms like memory, thick air heavy with smoke, sweat, and the earthy scent of mulled wine. Sailors crowd around long tables, faces red and steaming, telling lies that would freeze in mid-air outside. A musician strums a three-stringed lyre, coaxing out a melody that sways between melancholy and mischief. You sit by the fire and thaw slowly, watching the flames dance across the walls like the last survivors of some forgotten mural. The open scholarly debate drifts through your head, the question that divides historians. Did the Bosporus truly freeze, or was it metaphor, a poet's exaggeration of imperial stagnation? Looking at the ice outside, you realize the difference hardly matters. For the Byzantines, nature always doubled as commentary. A frozen sea meant a frozen empire. Thaw was redemption. Outside, the light begins to fade. You step back into the evening to find the Bosporus glowing faintly under a sky of cold violet. Ice groans softly, shifting as the tide presses beneath. The city's 1,000 lamps blink on one by one, gold scattered across blue. You walk along the wall until you reach the old lighthouse, its flame burning weakly behind a crust of frost. You lean on the parapet and watch as the first stars appear, reflected in the cracks of the ice below, constellations above and below, the empire suspended between heaven and sea. Your breath drifts upward, mingling with the smoke of a dozen hearths, and for a moment you feel the quiet grandeur of survival. The Bosporus, the city, the empire, they all endure the same way, by freezing just long enough to remember they're still alive. You leave the city again as winter tightens its grip, following the long road north where the empire's boundaries blur into rumor and legend. The landscape has gone monochrome, silver rivers, pewter skies, and forests black as spilled ink. You hear them before you see them, the Varangian guards, marching with a rhythm that sounds suspiciously like a tavern song being hummed through beards. When they emerge from the mist, they look less like men and more like an army of glaciers in motion. Furs of wolf and bear drape over chainmail, their axes slung across shoulders as casually as umbrellas. You step aside instinctively. No one blocks the path of hired frost giants. The air around them feels heavier, charged with that peculiar kind of loyalty that comes only from men who fight for both gold and belonging. They serve Byzantium, but they move with the confidence of men who could conquer it if they got bored. The lead guard nods to you, his eyes the color of winter steel, and you catch the faint smell of pine tar and salt, the North carried in miniature. You walk beside them, boots crunching through the crusted snow, and listen as they swap stories about frozen seas and wars fought under auroras. It's oddly comforting. Even mercenaries find warmth in repetition. The mainstream historical fact flickers into thought. The Varangian Guard was formed under Emperor Basil II around the year 988, its ranks filled with Norsemen and Russ warriors who found Byzantine coin far more reliable than northern kings. Chroniclers called them the Emperor's axe-bearers, loyal only to the hand that paid them. Yet in the capital, they became something stranger, a brotherhood of foreigners who outlasted dynasties, drinking in the taverns of Constantinople and learning to swear in flawless Greek. You imagine one of them explaining frostbite to a court eunuch. It would be a short conversation. The march continues along the river. Every few miles a fortress looms, its gate decorated with icicles that glitter like teeth. The Varangians stop at one such outpost, hauling supplies from sledges while the local garrison watches with cautious admiration. Within minutes they've built a fire large enough to intimidate theology itself. You sit with them, passing a flask that smells faintly of burning courage. They joke about Byzantine cuisine, about silk robes, about priests who can't hold their wine. One carves runes into the haft of his axe, each line a prayer or a curse. It's hard to tell which. The quirky tidbit comes to mind that some Varangians carved their names into the marble walls of Hagia Sophia, graffiti still visible centuries later, their Nordic letters spelling out eternal mischief. They left proof not of conquest but of presence, a whisper of northern breath in the empire's lungs. You glance at their faces lit by firelight, hard, scarred, absurdly alive, and realize that Byzantium's strength wasn't isolation but absorption. It swallowed cultures like a glacier swallows stones, polishing them into endurance. The night deepens. Snow drifts down softly, muting even the crackle of flames. One of the guards begins to sing, a low tune that rolls like distant thunder. You don't understand the words, but the meaning is clear. Survival, loss, the way ice remembers footsteps. It rises, falls, fades, and in the silence that follows, you hear the empire breathing through them. The open scholarly debate slides into memory, whether the Varangians truly influenced Byzantine tactics or merely decorated its legend. Some historians insist they were little more than ceremonial guards. Others argue they infused the army with northern pragmatism. Watching these men sharpen axes by starlight, you suspect truth lies somewhere between. Byzantium adapted everything it touched, even the frost. When dawn comes, pale and merciless, the Varangians rise wordlessly, stamping snow from their boots. You walk with them until the road forks, their path leading toward another campaign, another forgotten border. As they fade into the distance, the sound of their axes jingling like wind chimes made of war, you feel a peculiar warmth. The empire survives because it knows how to borrow strength, to turn strangers into symbols, to make loyalty out of weather. You breathe deep, tasting the cold, and for a fleeting second, you imagine the empire itself, a vast, layered machine powered by fire and frost, poetry and paychecks rolling forward beneath the northern wind. The palace feels alive in winter, as if the cold itself has joined the civil service. You pause beneath a chandelier shaped like a wreath of iron vines, each leaf holding a trembling flame. Candles are everywhere here, hundreds, thousands, tiny suns burning just to remind the empire it's still morning somewhere. Their light dances across the marble floors, over the gold tesserae, through the translucent curtains that shiver with each draft from unseen doors. The shadows move too, bending and straightening like courtiers bowing to invisible emperors. It's mesmerizing, this slow choreography of light and loyalty. You wander deeper, boots squeaking faintly against the cold floor, and find a servant polishing silver chalices beside a window filmed with ice. He works in silence, sleeves rolled to the elbow, humming something tuneless. The reflection of his candle on the glass merges with the snowy city beyond, two worlds meeting at a shivering line. Through an archway you glimpse the imperial chapel, its domed ceiling painted with Christ Pantocrator, surrounded by angels who look decidedly uncomfortable in the draught. The marble pillars are wrapped in crimson cloth to trap heat, but the effort feels more decorative than practical. Inside, priests move like slow comets, their vestments shimmering faintly in the candlelight. The sound of their chanting seeps through the corridors, deep and resonant, filling the palace with a kind of deliberate patience. You realize how Byzantium turned temperature into ritual. Cold was a form of humility, warmth a privilege to be earned through ceremony. The mainstream historical fact floats up quietly, as if from the wax itself. Emperor Constantine VII, the scholar emperor, kept meticulous records of palace heating systems, bronze pipes running beneath the floors, ducts that carried warmth from giant furnaces deep in the basements. Some chroniclers even noted that the palace's thermal baths stayed open through blizzards, where senators soaked like particularly ambitious dumplings. The empire may have invented theological paradox, but it also mastered central heating, and you respect that combination. You turn into the Hall of Auguste, where tall bronze candelabra rise like trees heavy with fire. Each flame reflects off 100 surfaces, polished gold, wet marble, the eyes of a statue too beautiful to trust. A group of scribes sit at a long table near the wall, copying imperial decrees under the supervision of a secretary who keeps his inkpot close to the brazier so it won't freeze. You linger beside them, watching as each letter curls and straightens in disciplined elegance. Byzantium's handwriting always looks like it's performing a small miracle just to stay legible. At the far end of the hall, a door opens to reveal a narrower passage leading toward the Empress's private garden. You step through, half expecting frostbitten roses, and you are not disappointed. The hedges glitter with ice, the fountains frozen mid-song, the marble nymphs capped with snow, like reluctant saints. Yet amid all this stillness, someone has lit lanterns, small glass globes glowing amber through the white. The effect is almost musical. You move between them, hearing the faint crunch of snow underfoot and the distant hum of the Bosporus beyond the walls. The cold here feels gentler, tamed by wealth and design. You reach a terrace overlooking the city, where the domes of Hagia Sophia shimmer faintly under a wash of moonlight. From here, the entire capital looks like an illuminated manuscript written in frost. You rest your hands on the stone balustrade and feel its chill climb slowly into your arms. The empire below breathes in quiet rhythm, torchlight, smoke, the muted bells of distant monasteries marking an hour that hardly matters. For all its grandeur, Byzantium is still a creature of weather, glorious, inconvenient, alive. A servant appears behind you, carrying a tray with 2 steaming cups of something that smells faintly of cloves and citrus. He sets one beside you without a word, bows and vanishes into the shadows. You sip it, sweet, spiced, strong enough to melt melancholy, and watch your breath drift into the night. The quirky tidbit arrives right on time. Court physicians once prescribed mulled wine mixed with crushed pearls as a cure for melancholia born of winter gloom. The pearls supposedly reflected the warmth of heaven. You doubt the science, but the taste of extravagant placebo is unmistakable. You wander back inside as the wind begins to rise, carrying faint echoes of laughter from the upper galleries. In a corner near the Imperial Library, a group of philosophers are gathered around a brazier, debating whether snow is pure or merely lazy rain. One insists that purity implies motionlessness. Another argues that snow moves more elegantly than rain ever could. You listen smiling, because only Byzantium could turn weather into metaphysics before dessert. The brazier glows between them, a miniature sun circled by human thought. You continue down the corridor, the candlelight softening into gold mist. The walls here are painted with scenes of triumph, emperors on horseback, angels descending with laurel wreaths. But the cold has dulled the colors, making every victory look a little sleepy. You stop before one fresco depicting an emperor greeting the dawn, his hand raised toward rays of painted sunlight. The irony is exquisite. The real dawn outside would freeze him solid. You touch the edge of the wall where paint meets plaster and feel the slight grain beneath your glove, the heartbeat of craftsmanship still alive centuries later. Then, from deeper within the palace, you hear the sound of a harp, faint, almost imagined. It drifts through the air like the echo of a dream. You follow it through a series of dim corridors until you find the source, a young musician sitting by a hearth, fingers moving across silver strings that shimmer like starlight. The tune is slow, circular, endlessly returning to itself, a melody made for rooms like this, where time folds quietly around beauty. You lean against the doorway and listen. The flames throw soft light across the marble floor, and for the first time tonight, you feel the palace breathe. The open scholarly debate returns to your thoughts, the one about whether Byzantine luxury softened its rulers or merely insulated them from despair. Historians argue endlessly. Was opulence decay, or was it the empire's way of surviving ugliness through beauty? Standing here, you suspect it's both. The empire's secret was never moderation, it was excess made holy. The candle burns because it must. The silk drapes because someone refused to freeze without style. You watch the musician's hands pause, the final note trembling in the air, then fading into silence so complete it almost hurts. You step back toward the main hall, where the candles still burn steadily, their wax pooling in slow, deliberate rivers. The servants move among them, trimming wicks, straightening holders, keeping order in the small universe of light. You realize how many lives are devoted to maintaining brightness in a place built to worship endurance. Each flame costs effort, each flicker a decision to continue. You walk past them, listening to the faint hiss of burning wicks, and it sounds like whispering faith. Outside the windows, the city sleeps under a thin veil of snow. You can see the harbor lamps flickering through the mist, each reflection trembling on the ice like a hesitant heartbeat. Somewhere far below, the waves murmur against the seawall, frozen yet persistent, as if even the water cannot resist singing the empire's lullaby. You linger by the window, fingertips pressed to the cold glass, and whisper nothing at all, because silence feels appropriate. The palace behind you glows with the steady golden patience of a civilization determined to keep shining, even when the sun forgets its schedule. You think of all the hands, servants, artisans, scribes, emperors who've tended these same flames across centuries of frost and faith. Candles in the winter palace, small, stubborn fires against eternity's draft. You breathe in, let the wax-scented air fill your lungs, and exhale slowly, watching your breath rise into the glow. It mingles there, invisible yet real, another tiny offering to Byzantium's most enduring miracle, its refusal to go dark. Morning breaks over the Marmara, like a memory trying to remember itself, a dim band of silver light, sliding between cloud and sea. The palace bells toll faintly behind you as you cross the courtyard, their notes hollow with frost, each one falling into the snow and vanishing without echo. You descend toward the harbor, where ships lie trapped in their own reflections, ice binding them to stillness, their masts rising like frozen prayers. The guards salute with slow movements, fingers too numb for ceremony, and you realize that even gestures freeze here, words crystallizing in the air before dissolving. You walk toward the southern gate where the road bends away from the cold capital and stretches, at least in imagination, toward warmer seas. Every breath of air seems to carry a rumor that beyond these white plains there are islands still green, markets still loud, and mornings that do not bite. The soldiers whisper about Crete and Cyprus, the way monks whisper about heaven, vaguely certain it exists, uncertain they'll ever qualify for entry. You join them in daydreaming, because daydreams are the only transport not taxed by the imperial treasury. The first stretch of road is quiet, except for the caw of crows and the squeak of snow beneath hooves. A convoy trudges beside you, wagons loaded with amphorae of olive oil, bolts of faded silk, sacks of almonds meant for distant ports. The mules look unimpressed by the geography of empire. Every so often, a driver shouts and the sound shatters the stillness like a dropped plate. The wind carries the smell of the sea, faint but undeniable, and with it a flood of half-forgotten summers. You picture Crete in sunlight, whitewashed chapels, vines climbing over stone, the hum of bees in air so thick with heat it seems liquid. You've never been there, of course, but Byzantines are professional remembers. Nostalgia is an export product. The chroniclers record everything: wars, decrees, eclipses. But what they really specialize in is longing. The empire endures through paperwork and yearning in equal measure. By midday, you stop at a roadside inn built of limestone and stubborn optimism. The fire in its hearth smolders lazily, the room filled with that damp, smoky warmth unique to travelers too tired to complain. You sit among merchants and soldiers, listening as they trade stories of places the cold can't reach. One swears he saw oranges ripening in the gardens of Antioch only last month. Another claims the fountains of Alexandria still run even in February. They speak as if the South is not merely geography but theology, a paradise designed to reward the frostbitten faithful. You sip watered wine that tastes faintly of iron, and smile at their exaggerations. The mainstream historical fact floats up from memory that during particularly harsh winters, the Imperial Navy sometimes diverted ships from the Aegean to carry grain and fruit northward, filling Constantinople's markets with figs and pomegranates that sold for the price of confession. You imagine senators bartering over citrus while soldiers gnawed frozen bread, and it all feels perfectly Byzantine luxury as diplomacy, calories as faith. The innkeeper's daughter brings bread fresh from the hearth, its crust blistered and blackened, and for a moment the smell alone is enough to thaw your soul. You tear it open and watch the steam rise, curling into the air like a miniature miracle. The soldiers at the next table joke that they should petition the patriarch to canonize soup. You laugh quietly and think how humor becomes a survival strategy here, a fire that burns without fuel. Outside, snowflakes begin to drift again, lazy as bureaucrats on payday, and the landscape dims into gray silence. You close your eyes, letting the crackle of the fire and the rhythm of voices lull you into that half-dream state where memory and imagination trade places. You see palm trees, hear gulls, taste sun. The empire breathes somewhere warm, while its northern half shivers. When you wake, the room is nearly empty. The soldiers have gone, leaving only their laughter behind like footprints in melted snow. You step outside, the air sharp enough to slice, and begin walking again. The sky has cleared, showing a sun that looks decorative rather than functional. You climb a low hill overlooking the sea, where the horizon blurs into pale silver. In the distance, a ship moves, a miracle in motion. Its oars break through a thin crust of ice, sending shards spinning like glass birds. You watch, transfixed, as it struggles toward open water, sails catching the weak wind. The sound of it, wood groaning, ropes creaking, is more music than noise. It's the anthem of persistence. You remember the quirky tidbit that sailors in winter sometimes burned strips of old parchment to light their braziers, claiming the inked words of psalms made the flames sing truer. You smile at the image, theology literally fueling navigation. In Byzantium, even superstition was footnoted. You descend the hill and follow the coastline for hours, passing small villages half buried under snow. The people here move through their routines with practiced endurance, fishermen mending nets indoors, women washing clothes in basins of melted ice, children rolling snow into shapes that could be either saints or snowmen, depending on your theology. Every doorway smells of smoke and patience. At one hut, an old woman invites you to share her fire. Inside, the walls are lined with icons darkened by soot, their faces soft and forgiving. She pours you a cup of warm milk flavored with honey and tells you about her son, a sailor who once brought her sand from Cyprus in a little jar. She keeps it by the window and swears that even in midwinter, it glows faintly at dusk. You believe her because you want to. The empire runs on such tiny truths, the kind that survive when evidence freezes. Outside again, the wind shifts, bringing the distant roar of waves crashing against the frozen shore. The sound feels alive, impatient, as if the sea itself dreams of thawing. You walk until the road disappears into marshland, glazed with ice. Reeds rattle softly, and the light begins to fade into that endless Byzantine twilight where everything seems both sacred and exhausted. The scholarly debate drifts into your thoughts, the endless question of whether the empire's strength came from faith in the divine or from sheer administrative stamina. Historians argue about doctrines, but out here, watching villagers light their evening fires, you see a simpler truth. Byzantium survives because its people have mastered the art of waiting. You stop by a frozen inlet, where the water beneath the ice pulses faintly with trapped tide. The sunset spreads across it like spilled gold leaf, turning cracks into veins of light. You stand there, breathing in the cold, until it feels like prayer, and imagine the south again, its bright markets, its sea salt, its warmth so thick it could be bottled. You realize you've never actually felt that warmth. It exists only as contrast, the promise that gives the cold meaning. The empire endures on such contrasts, marble and mud, silk and smoke, faith and fatigue. You smile, realizing that dreaming of warmth is a kind of warmth. The first stars appear, small and sharp as pins. Behind you, the lights of distant houses flicker like constellations laid across the snow. Somewhere, a dog barks. Somewhere else, a bell tolls the hour for evening prayers. You turn back toward the city, your breath curling into mist that glows faintly in the starlight. Each step feels lighter, as if the thought of the south imagined unreachable, eternal, has melted some invisible weight. You walk on, the wind at your back now, carrying the faintest scent of salt and citrus. In Byzantium, you think, faith is not about believing in miracles, it's about remembering the ones you've never seen. The dream of the warm south lingers behind your eyes, a promise whispered by snow itself. Spring will come, not today but someday, and the empire will pretend it expected it all along. You can almost see them, the banners of purple and gold snapping in the wind, the lines of soldiers glittering with lamellar. The Emperor Romanos IV himself, riding at the center, face shadowed beneath his helmet, gaze fixed on eternity and logistics reports. He thought he was marching into victory. Instead, he was walking into the most elegant disaster in world history. You know how this ends, but still you follow the ghosts down into the valley.
The snow crunches underfoot like parchment being crumpled. Around you the wind rises, carrying faint echoes, shouts, hoofbeats, the clang of metal that may or may not be imagination. You stop beside a half-buried stone marker, its inscription eroded to faint grooves. Someone has carved a cross into its face centuries later, a gesture both apology and epitaph. You brush the snow away and the cold bites through your gloves like memory. The mainstream historical fact returns to you with cruel precision. In this very place, the Byzantine army met the Seljuk Turks under Alp Arslan, and by the end of that long, luminous day, the empire lost not just a battle, but the illusion of being eternal. The emperor himself was captured, a moment so humiliating and human that even the chronicles blush to describe it. The legend says Alp Arslan treated him with respect, setting him free after ransom, but the empire never recovered its balance. You look around at the empty field, and it's difficult to believe the world could ever hold that much noise. The snow begins to fall harder now, the flakes large and lazy, drifting down like ash from an invisible fire. The sky turns to pewter. The horizon vanishes. You walk through the silence, every step heavier than it should be, as if you're dragging the empire behind you. You imagine the soldiers on that day, hungry, tired, confused by conflicting orders. You see the Varangian guards holding their line, axes flashing while cavalry charges collapse into chaos. The empire was too used to walls and sermons. Open plains were not its natural habitat. You remember the chronicler's favorite metaphor? The empire as a mirror reflecting heaven. On this field, that mirror cracked and reflected the sky's indifference. You stopped near where the emperor's tent would have stood, though now there is nothing but wind. The thought creeps in, uninvited but persistent. What did it feel like for Romanos when he realized the line was breaking, when the banners were falling, when history had chosen a new direction and forgot to send him the memo? Perhaps he thought of the palace candles, the gold ceilings, the endless arguments about divine will. Perhaps he thought of home. Or perhaps he was too busy being mortal to think at all. Snow begins to settle on your cloak, clinging in soft white layers, and you feel an absurd kinship with that long-defeated emperor. Both of you standing in a place that no longer listens. You find a small ruin, just a few stones forming the corner of what might once have been a chapel. Someone has carved a rough inscription in Armenian, another layer of voices added to the empire's endless choir of contradiction. Inside, a single icon lies face down in the snow, its paint faded, the wood split. You lift it carefully, and the image of a saint emerges, eyes almost erased, halo smudged, yet still unmistakably serene. You set it upright against the stone and light a small taper from your pocket, shielding the flame with your hands. The wind hisses but does not kill it. The glow flickers across the ruin, golden against the gray, as fragile as forgiveness. You think of the quirky tidbit that after Manzikert, Byzantine generals supposedly took to carrying small votive candles into battle to remind victory of its obligations. It's the kind of detail that only Byzantines could invent. Faith as superstition, superstition as administration. The snow deepens around your boots, the cold creeping into your bones like slow penance. You remember how the chroniclers tried to explain this defeat. Some blamed arrogance, others treachery, still others divine displeasure. Modern historians debate endlessly whether Manzikert was truly catastrophic or merely symbolic. But standing here, you can feel how symbols harden into weather. The empire lost more than soldiers that day. It lost its illusion of control, the delicate balance between bureaucracy and belief that had kept its wheels turning through centuries of chaos. The open scholarly debate drifts through your thoughts like fog. Was the empire's decline inevitable, or did it simply freeze to death here, one decision at a time? You suspect the answer, as always, is both obvious and irrelevant. Empires die slowly, and their ghosts attend all future meetings. You turn eastward, where the mountains rise like broken teeth, their slopes veined with snow and shadow. The Seljuks came from that direction, pouring down like another season, unstoppable and oddly beautiful in their precision. You try to imagine the moment of collision, the roar of cavalry, the scream of horns, the flutter of falling banners. You think of how snow muffles everything, even panic. The Byzantines had fought countless wars, but this one rewrote their vocabulary. The word border would never mean the same again. The light fades to blue, that deep Byzantine twilight that makes everything look carved from glass. You walk along a ridge overlooking the valley, your breath freezing in short, uneven bursts. Below you, the snow swirls in small eddies, erasing your footprints almost as fast as you make them. History, efficient as always. You pass a patch of black earth where the wind has stripped away the snow, revealing stones burned smooth by long-ago fires. Ash and snow, the two textures Byzantium could never stop touching. You kneel, scoop up a handful, and feel the strange warmth that lingers in the soil. The earth remembers heat even when everything above it forgets. In the distance, wolves howl. The sound echoes off the mountains, long and mournful, as if they're singing the empire's epitaph. You straighten, the sound filling your chest, and look up to see the first stars appearing, sharp as tears. The wind changes, bringing the scent of pine from some unseen forest. For a moment, the world feels alive again, as if defeat were just another kind of survival. You recall a line from one of the lesser-known chroniclers. His name lost, his parchment half burned. The snow did not kill us. It taught us the shape of our breath. You repeat it silently, letting the words melt into the cold air. Night deepens. The moon rises, pale and perfect, throwing silver across the valley. You stand in its glow, the ruin behind you, the endless steppe ahead, and feel the strange calm that comes after all explanations fail. Byzantium will continue, of course, it always does, but something essential was buried here beneath the ash and snow. You imagine future scholars arguing over causes and consequences, while the mountains keep their quiet counsel. The empire will retreat, adapt, disguise its losses in velvet and theology, but beneath it all, the wind from Montserrat will keep blowing through its corridors, whispering of a day when the mirror cracked and still reflected light. You turn back toward the west, your footprints already fading. The snow begins again, thick and soft, erasing everything except the faint glow of your candle still flickering behind in the ruin. You walk on through the silence, carrying that dim flame in your memory, its reflection trembling behind your eyes. In this empire, even defeat becomes sacred if you light it properly. The stars wheel above, indifferent but beautiful, and the night stretches wide, vast, and endless, like history, like faith, like the quiet breath between ash and snow. Dawn crawls back across the highlands with a shiver, turning the snow from silver to dull white, the kind of light that makes everything look carved out of fatigue. You descend from Montserrat's silent ridges toward a narrow valley where the remnants of an old monastery cling to the slope like a stubborn thought that refuses to die. Smoke rises from one of its chimneys, a thin, uncertain thread, proof that someone still believes in warmth. The path down is treacherous, stones hidden under layers of frost, and your legs ache with that familiar Byzantine combination of faith and regret. When you finally reach the gate, you find it half buried, the wood warped by centuries of snow. The door yields reluctantly, creaking like a tired argument, and you step inside to find the smell of incense, boiled herbs, and damp stone, Byzantium's 3 favorite perfumes. The monks have turned the ruins into a hospital of sorts, though hospital feels too ambitious for a place this quiet. The great hall is lined with low pallets, each occupied by a shape wrapped in layers of blankets, bandages, and theology. Some are veterans from recent skirmishes, others wanderers who mistook frostbite for divine punishment. A handful lie still and silent, their breaths slow, visible only as tiny ghosts above their faces. Candles flicker between them, transforming each bed into a small shrine. You realize this place is not for curing bodies so much as teaching patience to souls. A young monk greets you with a nod and offers a bowl of something steaming. It smells faintly of onion, honey, and good intentions. You sip and nearly burn your tongue. The broth is thin but alive, a sermon in liquid form. As you sit by the fire, the room hums softly with prayer. A handful of monks chant from memory, their voices low and rhythmic, filling the air with an ancient pulse that sounds more like breathing than music. A few of the wounded murmur along, half-conscious, the syllables spilling into the crackle of the fire. You catch fragments of Greek and Armenian intertwined, and for a moment the empire feels unified again. Its differences blurred by exhaustion. Above the hearth hangs a smoke-blackened icon of Saint Panteleimon, the healer, his painted hands outstretched in perpetual mercy. The gold leaf has darkened with age, the face smudged by centuries of candle soot, yet the eyes still gleam faintly when the light shifts. The mainstream historical fact drifts to the surface of your mind. After the catastrophe at Montserrat, countless monasteries across Asia Minor became informal refugees for veterans and refugees. Chroniclers describe monks tending frostbite with linen soaked in warm olive oil, mixing snowmelt with herbs to reduce fevers, and praying over wounds when medicine ran out. Byzantine medicine was equal parts science and superstition, though in fairness, so was most of life. You watch one monk grind something green in a mortar, muttering what might be a recipe or a blessing. He sprinkles the paste onto a bandaged arm, and the patient exhales with relief. Somewhere between pharmacy and miracle, Byzantium always finds a middle path. You wander into a side chamber where shelves sag beneath jars of ointment, bits of parchment, and relics that might once have been bones or optimism. In the corner, a monk sits beside an elderly soldier whose face looks carved from the same stone as the monastery walls. The man's hands are swollen, his skin mottled from frost, yet his eyes gleam with mischief. The monk humors him as he recounts stories of better winters that somehow sound worse. He insists he once saw a general sleep through an avalanche because he was dreaming of spring. You smile at the absurdity, though part of you believes it. Byzantines have a way of transforming misery into metaphor. The quirky tidbit returns to you, one of those odd fragments from a forgotten chronicle. Some monks prescribed onions roasted with incense for frostbite, claiming that the mixture draws out the cold humors by aroma. Others swore by heated wine poured over the feet while reciting psalms backward. You try to imagine the smell of that treatment, the steamy confusion of faith and desperation. It probably worked half the time simply because belief is the most effective antiseptic. Outside, snow continues to fall, blanketing the roof until the monastery feels buried in light. You step into the courtyard and watch flakes gather on a statue of an unnamed saint, his stone robe already white with accumulation. A small bird lands on his shoulder and shakes itself dry, oblivious to sanctity. You breathe in the stillness, and the air tastes like iron and incense. The sound of chanting follows you through the doorways, echoing against the cold stone like heartbeat against bone. In the refectory, monks prepare what passes for lunch: thin barley stew, black bread, and the occasional raisin, a Byzantine banquet of modest triumphs. You sit with them, and conversation drifts between theology and weather, as if both belong to the same department. One monk, older than the walls, recalls a winter so fierce the Bosporus froze solid and merchants walked their carts across it. Another insists the empire endures because it knows how to negotiate with the elements. You think of that phrase for a while, rolling it through your mind like a coin. Negotiate with the elements. It sounds like the empire's entire business plan. The open scholarly debate surfaces again, whether Byzantium's resilience sprang from faith or mere administrative stubbornness. Watching these monks patch cloaks with one hand and write hymns with the other, you suspect there was no difference. Their theology is simply paperwork written in candlelight. Even exhaustion becomes liturgy here. You glance at the walls, where faded frescoes depict saints standing ankle-deep in snow, their halos blazing like small suns. It's an oddly comforting image. Sanctity as thermal regulation. As evening falls, you walk once more through the infirmary. The candles burn lower now, and the air is thick with wax and prayer. A few of the wounded sleep in uneasy stillness, their breaths syncing with the rhythm of the monks chanting. One mutters in his dreams, perhaps reliving battle or begging forgiveness from his own bones. You adjust the blanket over him and realize the fabric smells faintly of lavender and smoke, the scent of care disguised as ritual. You pause beside the icon of the healer saint, studying the layers of soot built up over centuries. You wonder if the monks ever clean it, or if they prefer its current state. A face made dim by devotion, an image slowly absorbed by its own history. You reach out and feel the rough texture beneath your fingers, the uneven warmth of the wood near the candle flame. In that moment, the empire feels very close. The endless cycle of ruin and repair, belief and bureaucracy, warmth and frost. The wind rises outside, rattling the shutters. A monk crosses himself automatically and mutters that the northern passes will be impassable by morning. You imagine travelers caught out in the blizzard, their torches flickering like desperate punctuation marks across the white expanse. Perhaps some will find this monastery. Perhaps not. The empire's geography is a map of both salvation and statistics. For every soul who finds warmth, another becomes a footnote. Night deepens. The chanting fades to silence, replaced by the slow creak of wood and the occasional sigh from the sleepers. You step into the cloister where moonlight spills across the snow like spilled mercury. The arches cast long shadows and the cold feels cleaner here, stripped of superstition. You look up at the sky, so bright with stars it resembles the mosaics of the great palace, and think about how every shard of light is older than every empire. The thought should feel humbling. Instead, it feels oddly familiar. Byzantium has always lived inside time while pretending to decorate it. You stand there until your fingers ache, then retreat to the fire once more. The monks have gone to their cells, leaving the embers pulsing faintly in the dark. You sit beside them, letting the warmth seep into your palms, and imagine all the winters the Empire has survived, each one declaring itself the last, each one proven wrong. Perhaps endurance itself is the only true theology, to keep the flame alive even when faith becomes routine, to keep mending cloaks even as kingdoms unravel. Somewhere behind you, one of the wounded snores softly, and it sounds like a hymn from a simpler gospel. You smile into the fire. Outside, snow continues to fall, thick, steady, eternal, erasing the footprints of the living, covering the graves of the dead, blessing both with equal indifference. You whisper a quiet prayer to no one in particular, and watch it leave your mouth in a cloud of breath that rises, curls, and vanishes into the dark. In Byzantium, even the air knows how to pray.
The first crack of spring arrives not with trumpets, but with dripping water. It begins as a whisper at the eaves of the monastery, then becomes a slow, steady rhythm, snow sliding from rooftops, icicles loosening their grip, frozen gutters remembering their purpose. You wake to the sound of it and know without looking that winter's long siege has begun to retreat. The monks move about with a strange restlessness, sweeping slush from the courtyard as though performing a liturgy for change. The air still carries the chill of iron, but somewhere beneath it lies the scent of damp earth, that shy perfume of renewal. The empire, you realize, is thawing, not reborn, exactly, but yawning back into motion like a lion half asleep through history. You step outside. The valley that only yesterday was a monochrome dream now trembles with color. Brown earth peeks through the snow like parchment through scraped ink. Streams awaken under thin sheets of melting ice. A single bird calls from the trees, a sound so fragile it might break if acknowledged. You walk down to the riverbank and crouch beside the water, watching fragments of ice drift by like lost ideas. The sunlight catches them, turning each piece into a shard of glass, beautiful and disposable. Byzantium, you think, has always been made of such moments, delicate, luminous, destined to melt. When you return to the monastery, the monks are airing blankets and robes in the sun, their laughter unsteady, as if they've forgotten the shape of joy. In the kitchen, someone drops a pan, and everyone jumps, then laughs again because no one can remember the last loud noise that wasn't wind. The mood feels almost suspicious. Byzantines trust miracles only after paperwork confirms them. Still, a celebration is brewing. A young novice points excitedly to the hillside where snowdrops have pushed through the last crust of frost. Tiny white bells, shaking in the cold breeze. The sight silences the courtyard for a moment, as though everyone has just witnessed proof that God might still be detail-oriented. The mainstream historical fact glimmers in your mind. Every spring, when the Danube thawed and the mountain passes opened, the empire's machinery rumbled back to life. Caravans rolled out, garrisons rotated, ships left the Golden Horn heavy with trade goods and even heavier with hope. Taxes that froze mid-collection finally reached the treasury. Ambassadors returned from exile, disguised as diplomacy. Spring was the empire's annual resurrection, proof that bureaucracy too could bloom. You imagine scribes dusting their ledgers, clerks rediscovering enthusiasm for ink, and generals rediscovering optimism for logistics. Renewal in Byzantium always came with receipts. You spend the afternoon walking the road south, the same path you took through blizzards months ago. Now it feels unfamiliar. Streams carve new paths through the fields, glimmering under the weak sun. Farmers stand outside their cottages, pale and blinking, as though the world has been repainted without warning. They look at the returning birds like auditors inspecting miracles for errors. The empire's colors are back: mud, wheat, smoke, sky, the palette of survival. In the distance, the faint sound of church bells carries through the air, each peal dripping like meltwater, softer with every echo. You stop at a tavern near the river crossing, one of those half-collapsed way stations that always manages to resurrect itself between disasters. The door sticks, swollen with moisture, and the smell inside is wet wood, yeast, and good intentions. Travelers fill the benches, merchants, soldiers, and a pair of women selling spools of thread dyed in improbable shades of blue. Their laughter fills the room like spilled wine. You order a bowl of lentil stew and a cup of sweetened wine, and sit by the window, watching the light flicker on puddles outside. Conversation drifts toward rumor that the emperor has declared a new tax holiday for farmers, that trade with the Venetians will resume, that somewhere near Thessalonica the almond trees have already bloomed. No one knows which story is true, but belief itself seems to have thawed. You finish your meal and linger over the wine, feeling its warmth spread through you like memory. The quirky tidbit comes to mind. Chroniclers once described how spring feasts in Constantinople included a festival of first warmth, where bakers shaped loaves like suns and distributed them to passers-by, while choir boys sang hymns comparing butter to divine mercy. The empire, master of symbolism, could not resist turning weather into liturgy. You picture the scene, the domes shining under rain-washed skies, the streets slick with melting snow, the smell of yeast and incense blending into something holy enough to eat. Back on the road, you pass a caravan of merchants, heading north. Their wagons creak with cargo, salt, wine, bolts of cloth, and their guards walk with the lazy confidence of men who no longer expect frostbite. One of them calls out a greeting, and you exchange a few words about the weather, which in Byzantium qualifies as both theology and foreign policy. You walk together for a while, sharing jokes about winter rations and the virtues of soup. When they part ways, you watch their figures shrink into the shimmering air and feel the strange loneliness that follows laughter. The thaw brings not just warmth, but awareness of distance, of memory, of the spaces between lives. By evening, you reach a ridge overlooking a broad plain. The setting sun spills across it in bands of gold and copper, turning puddles into mirrors and the air into amber. You stop to breathe, to watch the empire rediscover color after months of grayscale. Down below, a village smokes gently, the scent of wood fires reaching you on the breeze. Cows stand in fields that yesterday were ice, their hooves sunk in mud that glistens like new paint. Everything looks temporary and infinite at once. You sit on a fallen log and take off your gloves. The air is still cold, but it feels bearable now, almost kind. You stretch your fingers and let the light fall across them, imagining the sun as an old friend who never sends letters but always remembers your name. Somewhere nearby, a stream trickles, its water full of reflected sky. The sound reminds you of the empire itself, constant, adaptable, never truly still. The open scholarly debate drifts into your thoughts again. How did Byzantium last so long when so many empires burned out faster than candles in wind? Some credit its bureaucracy, others its faith, others its geographical stubbornness. But sitting here, watching the thaw, you think the secret is simpler. Byzantium survived because it understood rhythm. Freeze, melt, rebuild, repeat. No glory lasts forever. No winter does either. The light fades, and the horizon blushes with the first deep pink of evening. You begin the walk back to the monastery, each step accompanied by the drip of melting snow from the trees above. The forest smells of wet bark and resurrection. In the distance, you hear frogs croaking, a crude but undeniable proof of life. For the first time in months, the cold no longer feels eternal. You realize that endurance is not about resisting change, but surviving it beautifully. The monks would call that wisdom. Historians would call it infrastructure. Either way, it's the empire's favorite trick. When you return, the courtyard glows with lamplight. The monks are gathered around a fire, singing softly. Their robes sway in the breeze, catching sparks of light like fireflies in motion. You sit beside them, sharing bread that tastes faintly of smoke, and listen. The song has no words, only melody, a long, low hum that rolls through the air like the river's thaw. It's not triumph they're singing, but release. You close your eyes, and for a moment the warmth feels infinite. Above, the night unfolds. Deep blue, edged with stars. The moon hangs low over the hills, reflected in every puddle, 1,000 broken mirrors collecting light. You breathe, and the air no longer stings. Around you the empire exhales after its long season of holding breath. Water drips from the roofs in perfect rhythm, a slow applause for survival. You look toward the horizon, where darkness meets the glimmer of the sea, and feel the pulse of 1,000 years whispering through the thaw. Byzantium endures not because it refuses to die, but because it knows how to begin again. Night returns softly, almost apologetically, as if even darkness fears disturbing the fragile warmth newly reborn. You leave the monastery behind for the final time, descending the winding road that threads through valleys now glistening with meltwater. The air carries that damp metallic scent of thaw, wet stone, running streams, and something older, the quiet breath of earth remembering how to live. Each step feels lighter, easier. You follow the path toward the heart of the empire, back to Constantinople, the city that has waited beneath winter's crown of ice for this slow resurrection. The moon rises early, its reflection chasing you across puddles and rivulets. Everywhere, the sound of dripping, from trees, from roofs, from statues of saints half encased in crystal. The empire, it seems, is unfreezing all at once. By the third day's journey, you glimpse the Sea of Marmara, a vast sheet of silver, half thawed, half mirror. The distant skyline of Constantinople gleams faintly beyond it, the city's domes glowing like embers under thin cloud. The air is soft enough now that gulls have returned, their cries sharp and bright against the hush of the evening. As you approach the Theodosian walls, you notice patches of moss darkening the stones where frost once clung, as if color itself is returning to the empire grain by grain. The gates stand open, their bronze hinges groaning with the effort of movement after months of stillness. You step through and feel the faintest shiver, not from cold but recognition. Inside, the city breathes again. The streets run with rivulets of melted snow, carrying with them soot, dust, and yesterday's despair. Merchants sweep out their thresholds. Cats reappear from whatever theological dimension they inhabit in winter. The air hums with a cautious optimism, the kind born from remembering what sunlight feels like. You follow the main avenue toward Hagia Sophia, its massive dome glowing under a veil of mist. Bells ring somewhere above the rooftops, not the solemn toll of survival, but a lighter, quicker rhythm, like laughter rediscovering its melody. The sound echoes down the colonnades, mingling with the slosh of water under passing carts and the chatter of citizens comparing this thaw to every thaw before it. You pause beside a fountain that has finally begun to flow again, its marble bowl streaked with the delicate scars of ice. The water dances in weak sunlight, refracting it into 1,000 trembling colors. For a moment you see the empire reflected there, battered, brilliant, absurdly alive. You lean down, cup your hands and drink. The water is cold, metallic, pure. It tastes like continuity. From the square you climb the steps toward Hagia Sophia. The doors stand open, and inside the vastness breathes a golden twilight. Candles burn again on the altars, their flames steadier now, their reflections rippling through the polished marble like threads of living fire. The smell of incense hangs in the air, sweet and familiar, curling into the high vaults where light filters through colored glass. The mosaic Christ looks down, his face half in shadow, half in radiance, a reminder that divinity in Byzantium is always about endurance through paradox. The congregation murmurs softly, their prayers flowing like the melting snow outside, quiet but unstoppable. You walk to the center of the nave and look upward. The dome seems impossibly high, yet the faintest whisper from below returns as echo, multiplied, perfected. It's as though the building itself remembers every voice it has ever sheltered. The mainstream historical fact drifts into memory. How each spring, after harsh winters, the emperor would hold a special liturgy in Hagia Sophia called the Feast of Renewal, blessing both soldiers and merchants, peasants and nobles, all equally victims of weather. Chroniclers noted that attendance was mandatory, though faith was optional. Still they came, hundreds of them wrapped in shawls and gratitude. The emperor himself would stand beneath the dome, gold crown reflecting candlelight, his voice trembling as he read the psalm of rebirth. The frost is melted, the seed remembers, the earth forgives. You imagine it now, the weight of those words filling this same air, echoing across the centuries until it finds you here, a wanderer carrying stories instead of banners. You slip back outside as evening settles. The city glows from within, every window a flicker of gold, every rooftop weeping water that catches the last of the sun. Somewhere near the harbor, laughter bursts out of a tavern door. Hoarse, human, welcome. You follow the sound for a while until it fades into the murmur of waves against the docks. The Bosporus gleams dark blue, streaked with ice that breaks apart in gentle sighs. Lanterns sway above moored ships. Sailors hum songs about southern winds and gulls that never freeze. You sit on a crate and watch the lights ripple across the surface of the water, thinking how even the sea seems uncertain whether to rest or move. A cat curls against your leg, its fur still damp. You scratch its head, and it purrs like a small engine of resilience. The quirky tidbit flits through your mind. One old chronicler claimed that, on the first night of spring thaw, citizens would release pigeons from the city walls carrying sprigs of green laurel. They believed the birds would fly south, find warmth and bring it back. Of course, most pigeons didn't get the memo, and simply loitered around the bakery, but the gesture itself, hope disguised as superstition, feels precisely right. Byzantium never trusted miracles it didn't organize. As the night deepens, mist drifts in from the sea, softening every sound. You wander through the narrow lanes of the city, past shuttered shops and quiet courtyards. The air grows colder again, but not cruelly so. It's the kind of chill that reminds you warmth still exists somewhere nearby. You pass a small chapel tucked between houses, its door ajar, and step inside. A single candle burns on the altar. No monks, no chants, just silence and flame. You stand there, listening to your own breathing, watching the wax pool and harden, melt and reform. The rhythm of it is hypnotic. You realize how easily faith and fire trade places here, each sustaining the other in secret. Outside, snow begins to fall again. Thin, hesitant flakes that catch the lamplight and spin like dust in sunlight. The streets shine with them, each flake dissolving as it lands, 1,000 tiny farewells. You walk along the sea walls where the city meets the dark, endless water. The towers of the palace rise behind you, faint silhouettes wrapped in golden haze. Somewhere within those walls, an emperor writes letters to distant governors about taxes, trade, and hope. Somewhere else, a child sleeps beside a window, dreaming of ships and spring. The empire, you think, is not marble or law, but this endless, unremarkable continuity, people warming their hands over the same coals century after century. You reach the edge of the harbor, where ice still lingers along the stones. The moon has climbed higher now, its light stretching across the Bosporus until it meets the Asian shore. The current moves slowly, carrying shards of ice that glimmer like stars fallen into the sea. You close your eyes and breathe the salt air, thick with the scent of wet rope, tar, and eternity. The city behind you hums softly, alive in every brick and shadow. The scholarly debate drifts faintly through your thoughts. Was the Byzantine Empire truly eternal in spirit, as its chroniclers believed, or merely skilled at surviving its own endings? Standing here, you find the question unimportant. Eternity, you realize, isn't about duration, it's about rhythm. Empires rise and fall, thaw and freeze, but this quiet, breathing persistence is as close to forever as humanity gets. You open your eyes again. Snow continues to fall, but gently now, settling on domes, statues, and the sleeping decks of ships. It clings to your cloak, to your hair, to the stone at your feet. The air has gone utterly still. You lift your face to the sky and feel the flakes melt against your skin. Cold, soft, perfect. The city around you fades into silence. The domes glow faintly, the streets shimmer, the sea whispers its slow applause. Everything seems suspended. Time, sound, even thought. And then in that hush, the story exhales its final breath. The empire stands, weary and luminous, under a blanket of snow that no longer threatens but comforts. The candles of Hagia Sophia burn steady, the bells sleep, the waves lap against the walls in rhythm with your heartbeat. You smile, faintly, knowing that Byzantium never truly ended. It simply learned how to dream in winter. The snow falls a little heavier, softening the world into peace. You close your eyes. The city breathes once more. The sound fades. End of script. Sweet dreams.